Welcome to the latest 𝐂𝐞𝐫 Perspectives podcast. I'm John Ross. I'm a member of the International Collective of 𝐂𝐶𝐫. Just to explain this series' purpose, which is people who understand present international tensions are created by the US, nevertheless have to respond to rapidly events. And then obviously times when there are discussions regarding differences of evaluation and experience, which there's a need to discuss. Therefore, while 𝐂𝐶𝐫's main activities are opposing the aggressive policies of the United States, we also want to provide in the Perspective series a framework to discuss those issues amongst those who are on the same basic side. Arnaud Bertrand, today's guest, is one of the most people we would like to have here, and I'm so pleased that he's making, because he's such a valuable contributor to this discussion, because he's one of the most balanced and measured commentators on China. Some people opposing US policy think that there is some use in exaggerated propaganda or exaggerated rhetoric or something. This is not true. In serious matters, there is no virtue in optimism. There's no virtue in pessimism. There is only a virtue in realism. Arnaud's writings on Twitter and X, day after day, put out a balanced, clear analysis of China. I read it every day, and I recommend everybody else does the same. We'll have the details of his X and Twitter account up for you to see at the end of the session. One of the biggest news events confronting being discussed at the present time is obviously Trump's initiatives towards Russia to try to bring to an end, or whatever he's trying to do, with the Ukraine war. My analysis of this is coloured very much by living in Moscow in 1992 to 2000. It's the following. War in Ukraine was entirely predictable a long time ago. At that time, I said it was going to take place. I thought it would take starting 10 to 15 years. It in fact took 30, but that's just a detail. This was caused by the aggressive intention of NATO to expand itself into the Ukraine. But in that war, the combination of Russia, whose army is doing the fighting, China, who has refused to break off normal economic relationships with Russia, and the global South, which has refused to go along with the sanctions against Russia proposed by the United States, has proved itself to be more powerful than NATO. And therefore, this has created a situation where NATO is going to experience the worst military defeat in its history, and for the United States, its biggest defeat since the Vietnam War. Faced with this, Trump has decided that the US must seek to divide three forces, which have turned out in the case of Ukraine to be too strong. The US considers China its most powerful enemy, therefore the US must seek to separate Russia and the global South from China. Against the global South, the US relies mainly on physical military force, genocide against the Palestinians, threats of war against Iran, sanctions and threats against Venezuela, and so on. But against Russia, such military action is impossible because it's a very large military power. Therefore, Trump decided to attempt what has been termed the reverse Kissinger, to attempt to create distance between Russia and China by improving relations between the US and Russia. The analysis I would make is not that this is necessarily going to succeed. In fact, there are great difficulties in the way of it, but that this is what Trump's policy is. Arnaud has explained and has his own view of the course of the event, so we very much wanted to give him the chance to explain it to our viewers. So over to you, Arnaud.
First of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the kind words. I'm very honored. Yes, so I did write about this. So first of all, on this reverse Kissinger, it's important to remind a bit the what happened in the first in the first time this happened. Kissinger didn't actually split China and the Soviet Union. It's a mistake that I sometimes hear people make. He merely exploited an existing split that had already been the case for quite a few years. And it's one thing to exploit an existing split. It's another thing entirely, and it's obviously much harder to split two countries like China and Russia, which have no fundamental differences today. So that's the first point. My second point, I completely agree with you that is probably something that whether Trump himself or some people in his administration would very much like to do, because we're in a world with three great powers, China, the US, and Russia. And obviously, the US sees it has no other great power on its side of the ledger, which is not a very comfortable strategic position for them. So it is obviously something that they would like to do. But my basic position is that there is basically very little to no chance of it happening. On the biggest reason for me, is because China and Russia are achieving right now what they've always said they wanted, which is the emergence of a multipolar world where they each are an important pole. So I don't think it will be in Russia's geopolitical interest to just, suddenly decide to throw that away and side with the US, which would have the effect of restoring, putting Russia on a path to help the US restore its hegemony. Why would, the two torchbearers of the global south split just as the emergence of the long-thought multipolar order is finally coming true? So that wouldn't make sense to me. And then I don't think it's also in Russia's economic interest. Russia is actually quite complementary, economically speaking, with China. But that's not the case with the US. So as we all know, Russia's main export is oil, petrol, and that's one of China's main imports. But the US is now the world's most important producer of oil and petrol. So, they simply don't have the need to buy Russia's main export when China does. And what we've seen after the war in Ukraine, with the sanctions and the almost complete halt of trade between Russia and the West, Russia and the US, Russia and Europe, what we saw is that actually had very little impact on Russia's economy. And in fact, it might even have had somewhat positive impact, because if we look last year, if I'm not mistaken, Russia's economy was the fastest growing economy in Europe. So this shows that the West, the US in particular, they don't have much to bring to the table for Russia, because them stopping trade just doesn't matter much, and therefore them restoring it, redoing business with Russia doesn't matter either. Whereas breaking with China will be extremely destructive for Russian economy. I checked the number. Before the war in Ukraine, for the period 2015-2019, imports from Russia to the US averaged about $18 billion a year. That's when the relationship was still okay. It was before the war. That's what good looks like. $18 billion a year imported from Russia to the US. Last year, China imported about $130 billion from Russia. So we're talking 7 times more, which is huge. So why would they, give up on those 130 billion to, at best, get $18 billion a year from the US? Another reason is that, of course, China is Russia's biggest neighbor. Let's remember that the China-Russia border is the largest border in the world, and that China is vastly more powerful than Russia. So just on that basis, why would they want to antagonize them, especially when what they will get in exchange is so little, and they will, lose so much, economically speaking. And then there is the lesson from history. Russians are famous to be students of history. You just need to listen to a speech by Putin to see that. What happened when they decided to trust the West? It's the entire reason for the Ukraine war, is because they trusted the not 1 inch eastward promised by Baker, and turns out they were foolish to trust that. And they trusted the West on Minsk as well, and turns out they were foolish to trust that. So I don't think, they will be ready to trust the West again anytime soon, especially a character like Donald Trump or the people around him, who is obviously eminently untrustworthy. And of course, as a very last point, all the messaging from the leaders on both sides categorically deny that there is any chance of it happening. Like, let me quote Sergei Lavrov, who wrote that on X not that long ago. He wrote, "We never had relations with China which were that good, long-term built, and that would be enjoying support of both countries, people like we have now. The Americans know that we will not betray our commitments, which we developed with China." So to conclude, both sides say it won't happen. It's not in neither side's interest for it to happen, speaking about either economic or geopolitical interest. And history has many lessons teaching both sides that it would be a bad idea to do it. So that's why, in my opinion, it won't happen.
Just very quickly to come back on this, I entirely agree with you that it's against Russia's national interests. But I lived in Russia in the 1990s, and I saw very huge forces at that time who ruled the country, who acted directly against Russia's interests under Yeltsin. These were forces who looted the country. Their main aim was to be able to get capital out of Russia. And there was a joke, but it was a quite serious joke, which was participate in Russia's economic boom, buy property in the south of France, by which but the estimates were they took $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion out of Russia. They're now blocked by measures which have been taken, by, for example, the capital controls. But I don't think these forces have disappeared. Some have fled the country, like Anatoly Chubais, who was one of their leaders, but others are still within Russia. And so my strategic view is that is the forces that the United States wants to link up with. I'm not saying that will happen, but I believe that there are serious forces within Russia which the United States could help to link up with against Russia's national interests. That would be the point that I'd make to you.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm happy to admit that I'm not a Russia specialist, and you probably know Russia much better than I do, because I've actually never been there. Whereas, as you said, you used to live there. So for me, it's hard to judge this aspect specifically, but just thinking logically, if these oligarchs, if their main motivation is money, then, as we just saw, there is clearly much more money coming from China than there ever was, even before the war, from the US. Is the US ready to spend $130 billion a year buying stuff from Russia as China does? All the more stuff that they don't need, given that Russia's main export is petrol, and the US is already the world's largest producer of petrol. So I have a hard time believing that that will happen, especially coming from Trump, whose entire shtick is reducing America's trade deficit. Secondly, as you rightly point out, letting these oligarchs reign free did bring the country to disaster in the 1990s, which is largely why Putin came to power and had to spend so much energy trying to rein them in. So it's fair to expect that Russian society has developed at least some antibodies against this happening again. And lastly, perhaps most importantly, speaking about money, look at what's happening to those doing business with the US right now. The more money they make by selling stuff to the US, the more punished they are for it with the Trump tariff. Medvedev actually wrote something about this yesterday on Twitter, tellingly quoting Lao Tzu. The quote was actually fake, but that's besides the point. He wrote, "As it is, Russia barely does any trade with the US and the EU. Nearly all of it is under sanction, yet our economy is growing 3% now. will take the advice of Lao Tzu and sit by the river waiting for the body of the enemy to float by. So I think at the present moment, the Russians, oligarchs or not, are actually counting their blessing not to be too exposed to the West economically with the chaos that's going on there.
Thank you very much, Arnaud. Obviously, we'll have to see how events fold, and I'm sure we'll continue this discussion at some point in the future.